Welcome to Commander Central, episode 212. Today, we're going to be talking about counterspells, namely how to pick the right ones for your deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today?
Doing great. How about yourself, Dana?
It's a Friday. I'm feeling pretty good. I've been doing a few house projects today in between work stuff. I wound up having to tear out a toilet out of a guest bathroom that was horribly installed. So a hacksaw and a Dremel tool were required to get that out. And then it also had one of those like blue bleach dye tabs in the back tank that had been there since we moved in.
Oh,
and we
no.
assumed it had mostly ran out, but it had kind of just congealed at the bottom. So once I started like fishing around and doing stuff, that basically broke open again. So my hands, I've got like blue fingernails and blue. Yeah, so
It's like you pulled the fire alarm at school.
yes, right. Yeah. So that's fun. But you know what? I got it out. So I'm happy about that. And it's the weekend, and all in all, I can't complain.
Fair enough.
And we got to play some games before the 4th of July, so I especially can't complain.
That is true. We did get together and get to play some games in person. That was a blast.
Yeah, we had a couple of friends that had done a good job with their social distancing, so we, day before 4th of July, got together at my place and cooked out and smoked some cigars and had some beers and played a handful of EDH games. And I think you won, did you win 2?
I won 2, and I think you won 3.
2 or 3. I had a good game with my Sphinx deck where I was at 1 life.
Ugh.
Managed to stabilize that for like 3 turns before I won. With everyone going like, we should make sure we kill him because he's going to come back and win this at 1 life. And I did manage to come back and win. So that one was pretty good. And you won with, was it a Brago game? You won 1?
No, I won a Tuvasa game at like 400 life.
That's right. Although we did do a good bit of damage to you. We did, it wasn't like it was 400 life and you were out of range. We hit you pretty hard, but you still won it.
Yeah, I think I was at like 400 something, and over the next couple turns, you guys knocked me down to 200 something, but yeah. I still was able to come back and just power through.
It was too much.
Then I won with my Tulane deck, because that's what Tulane does, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Too much Tulane advantage. I played a couple games last night on webcam as well with Zach Taylor of Commander Social and Brando of Commander Cookout and Lenny Woolley, who was our guest here last week. So we fired up. I think we played 2 games. The most notable one was the second game I won playing my Athreos Pestilence deck. And I had taken out Zach with a big Pestilence burst. And I think Lenny had killed the Crypt Rats I was using for a Pestilence effect. So I went to, on my turn, get the Crypt Rats back with Savin's Reclamation, but Lenny then got rid of the Crypt Rats with a Stonecloaker at instant speed. You can flash it in and exile a card from a graveyard, so he hit my Crypt Rats. I had control of an Oracle of Moldiah from Brando I had gotten with Athros' ability, so I could see the top card of my library and play it, and it was a land, so I just played the land. And then there was a Withering Wisps on the top, so I was able to use the flashback on Savin's Reclamation to cast a Pariah, which didn't wind up mattering, and a Mind Stone to crack the Mind Stone to draw that top card, which was the Withering Wisps, to put it into play. And I also, at that point, had already had a Death Pits of Wrath in play, so like 1 damage kills a creature. And I could, with like the 2 mana I had left, put in a Withering Wisp to do 2 damage to both of them and wipe their creatures off the board. And my creatures don't take damage on my turn because of some enchantment I had out. So then I could deal lethal to both of them. So that felt good, being able to like flashback Savin's Reclamation to use Mind Stone just for the draw to get the top card that I could only see because of the Oracle I had stolen with Athreos. So a bunch of things came together simultaneously to let that happen.
Very nice.
That was a good one. Yeah, that was a fun webcam game as well. So the last week I've just had a bunch of games get played, and that always helps make doing the podcast more fun, makes it something to look forward to when you can actually have gotten some games and versus just talking about it in theory. If you out there in the listener land like to reach out to us and talk about some cool games you played or just anything at all, how would you do that, Max?
You can hit us up on Twitter at CMDR Central, send us a Facebook message by searching CMDR Central, and you can also just hit us up on patreon.com/CMDR Central.
And, any support we get from anybody, whether it's on Patreon or just a like or an upvote on any of the social media platforms we're on, be it YouTube or iTunes, we really appreciate that too. Anything like that, any kind of engagement at all is very helpful, and it does mean a lot and goes a long way to keep the show running. So thank you to everyone who supports us in any way they can. So, main show topic. Should we jump right into it here, Vax?
Let's talk about Counterspells.
How many decks do you currently have that have Counterspells in them, out of curiosity?
3. 3 of my 6 decks. Yep.
Okay. I have 3 as well. I have 5 blue decks. One's a 5-color deck that doesn't have any Counterspells, so I don't really count that. So of my 4 decks that are predominantly blue in some way, shape, or form, 3 of the 4 do have counters. And we'll get into the specifics of those decks in a little bit. The main focus here, we're not going to talk about Counterspells just generically, but we want to specifically talk about what ones you put into your deck and how you make that decision about which ones to run. I think for some categories of spells, there isn't necessarily a lot of thought that goes into it. If you're playing white and you want to run removal, generally speaking, it's pretty obvious that Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile are things you run. How good they are doesn't really change based on what your deck is doing or how your deck is built or how you play. Same thing is kind of true of removal spells in most colors. I think the same is true of like the ramp spells in green, for example. I don't think you really have to put a lot of thought into what your deck is doing to realize Nature's Lore is a really good ramp spell. Mana Rocks are the same way. Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are good in any deck for the most part. It's obviously not 100% true, but like generally speaking, what's good is good in most categories. And I think that isn't as true in Counterspells. There's obviously some that are going to be good in any situation, but because you tend to run, usually most decks are running 4, 5, 6, if not more Counterspells. Once you get past like the really great 1 or 2, there's a lot more thought that has to go into which ones you want to run. And I think we should take a look at that because I think it's kind of interesting to figure out why people make the choices they make.
Works for me.
We'll just look at the top 20 most popular Counterspells in EDHRec just to let you know what they are. You want to do the first 10 for us here, Max?
Sure. So starting off at number 1 is Original Counterspell, followed up by Swan Song, Negate, Arcane Denial, Disallow, Mana Drain, Force of Will, Pact of Negation, Narset's Reversal, Muddle the Mixture. So those are your top 10.
And then the 11 through 12 slots, or excuse me, 11 through 20 slots, we have Dispel, Rewind, Mystic Confluence, Flusterstorm, Cryptic Command, Mental Misstep, Unwind, Force of Negation, Mana Leak, and Spell Pierce. Are there any ones, Max, that you were kind of surprised to see on that list?
Dispel being one of them, and Flusterstorm, and that might just be like CEDH factoring in there, but those were the 2 for sure that caught my eye.
Same here with Flusterstorm in particular, because that tends to... It's a great card in that kind of environment where there's a lot of stuff going on the stack simultaneously, and I think that tends to usually be CDH. So that one did surprise me a little bit. Also, the price on it was outrageous for a long time, and it's much cheaper now, but there was a long period of time it was really difficult to get, too. Although that's true of a lot of these. Mana Drain, Force of Will, Pact of Negation. Mystic Confluence isn't cheap. That's still over $5. Cryptic Command is still not cheap. Force of Negation is, I think, over $30. So there's a lot of cost that factors in here, too. And when thinking about this, there were 3 factors that kind of popped up to me in terms of selecting your Counterspells. The first would be the mana cost, both in terms of converted mana cost and the number of pips in the mana cost. Yeah, Trip Blue for Archmage's Charm is a much more specific thing, a much more difficult thing to hit than, say, Unwind, which is 2 and a blue. The next factor is what the spells in question can counter. Some Counterspells are just hard counterspells, but some only hit instant and sorceries, and some only hit, say creatures or what have you. And some decks care about one of those things over another, and I think that makes a difference. And the actual cost of the card, too. Like, some people just can't afford to run that Mana Drain because it's a crazy expensive card. So there's some factors there. I think that puts it a lot in league with things like Mana Crypt, where it's obviously a great mana rock, but if people aren't running it, it's not because it's not good, it's because it's expensive.
Yeah, for sure.
Does that make sense to you? Are there any other factors that you consider, Max, when it comes to the ones you choose?
No, I think these 3 points that you have listed are great. The other thing I kind of think about, and this is more just for overall when I build a deck, is how's it going to play in my local meta? Because maybe you do want something like Dispel, because you run up against a lot of spell slinging decks, so you want something that, counters an instant versus just a hard counter. So I think that also plays a bit of effect into it, but I think the other 3 are way more better reasons to why you choose a counterspell.
I also think the one I debated putting on here was your play style or the deck's particular play style, and I think that makes a difference. But that usually then takes the form of CMC, so we can maybe call that 1-2. But I had a tough time kind of differentiating between those 2 different things. But that might be one as well. Some decks that play a certain way are more interested in one kind of counterspell over another, and that will probably be something I can reference a little bit later on when we talk about some specific decks, which I guess we can jump into right now here. A good way to get into this is to maybe talk about real-world examples of choices we've personally made when it comes to counterspells. So why don't we just take turns here talking about our individual decks, Max, and what counterspells we're running and why we made those choices maybe. And we can just kind of talk about why we've made the choice to run the ones we're running and why we've chosen to not run some of the other most popular ones. Because I think it's always good to hear people explain their rationale for something. It's then useful to hear that, to apply it to why you're doing what you're doing. So I can go first, and I mentioned this deck in the games we played segment earlier, my Isperia Supreme Judge Sphinx Tribal deck. It's running 6 counterspells total. Technically, Overwhelming Intellect is a counterspell, but it's countering creatures in order to draw me cards. Like, I'm not relying on that to stop something bad from happening. So, ignoring that one, the 6 counterspells in the deck are Arcane Denial, Delay, Dovin's Veto, Mana Drain, Stubborn Denial, and Swan Song. What I think is relevant about these in terms of the choices I've made, only one of those 6 has double blue pips in the casting cost, and that's Mana Drain. And I think Mana Drain justifies that for being disgustingly good.
For being Mana Drain, yeah.
Yeah, like if someone stole my Mana Drain and I didn't have a way to get another one, don't know if I would replace that with regular counterspell. I think I would replace it with something else, I don't know, maybe a negate or something. And the reason that is because my deck is really, really, really hungry for blue mana. I think of the 18 Sphinxes in the deck, I think 17 of them have at least double blue in the casting cost, and the multiple have triple blue. So it becomes really difficult when I'm spending, at least 2 blue mana during my main phase, if not more for the rest of the casting cost, to then leave 2 blue mana up for a counterspell. So in that deck, the pips are very, very relevant. I really want to make sure I use as little blue mana as possible on counterspells because I need so much of it to cast those Sphinxes in my actual turns. The second thing relevant here is those are all 2 mana or less counterspells. And that's for a similar reason as to why I have minimal blue. Sphinxes cost a gazillion mana to cast. I think on average, it's like 14 mana per Sphinx or so, if you break it down. And so I can't, if I'm spending, this is 5 or 6 mana, usually what it is, for a Sphinx in the main phase, I just can't leave 4 mana up for Cryptic Command or 5 mana up for Mana Confluence. I just don't have that much mana in the deck free to leave those big counterspells up. So again, I'm running ones that are both efficient in terms of how much blue mana they use, and they're efficient in terms of how much mana they use total. I just can't afford to run if you call it a luxury counterspell that comes with extra bonuses tacked on, because I just can't afford to leave that amount of mana up. The other thing is I'm pretty comfortable in this deck running Dovin's Veto and Negate and Swan Song that don't hit creatures. Those are, for the most part, Negate and Dovin's Veto are non-creature, and Swan Song is just instant sorcery or enchantment. Part of the reason that is because creatures really don't cost me the game that often. Someone's going to drop a Avenger's Zendikar once in a while or a Crater Hoof, and I can't stop it with a Negate, and that sucks. But by and large, the things that screw me over the most are board wipes. When I've played 2 Sphinxes that cost me 7 mana to drop, and something else, I can't. That's such an investment to lose it to a Wrath of God. That's my primary concern in that particular deck versus someone just winning with a Crater Hoof. it's going to happen, but I would rather protect myself from the much more common board wipes than I would worry about somebody's Elvish Norn or something that's unfortunate like that. So that's the breakdown of my counterspell selection in that deck and why I chose what I chose and why I haven't chose other really good spells. Why don't we jump to one of yours next, Max? We can talk about Brago.
Yeah, so let's talk about Brago. This is the deck that has the most counterspells in it that I play. So Brago has 5 total. It has a Force of Will, a Mystic Confluence, Pact of Negation, Render Silent, and Rewind. Like you kind of went through with your Asperia deck, 3 of those have double blue in their casting cost, and 2 of them can be cast if I'm tapped out, which is nice.
So a couple of these, Mystic Confluence is 5 mana, Render Silent is 3, Rewind is 4. As someone who's played against this deck, my observation here, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, you untap so many artifacts and so much stuff with Brago. You run a bunch of mana rocks in there, and when Brago hits, you can, not untap, but you can blink that stuff and have it come back into play untapped. It's much easier for you to have that 3 colorless mana to dump into a Mystic Confluence after having already used the mana rock anyway during your main phase than it perhaps is for me in Asperia. Is that why you're okay with running a couple bigger spells?
That is definitely one of the reasons my mana rocks make both the colorless and some make the colored mana, so I may be tapped out on my lands, but I definitely have the artifacts, like you said, to pay for all of these spells, ideally. Another thing is, and this is a big difference between you and I think just our playstyles, is I want that hard counter. I don't want Swan Song because I want to be able to stop that Crater Hoof or that Avenger or that Wrath of God or that Cyclonic Rift. I just don't want to have to be like, oh, I wish I would have this in my hand. Instead, I'm stuck with a negate. I don't want to be in that situation. I just want to be able to say, I counter it, we move on.
And these are all hard counters. Every one of these just
Correct.
counters the spell, doesn't care, just stops.
Correct. Mystic Confluence being, 5 mana, I actually I kind of look at it as a draw spell, but I also look at it as more of if I'm facing a commander I don't want to deal with maybe early on in the game, like if you land your commander early and you'll probably take control of the game, I really like having Mystic Confluence for that tempo hit, like, oh, your commander, you had to tap out for it, you can't pay the 3 extra, and I'm going to draw 2 cards. That's just ideal in my world.
One thing about Mystic Confluence, not that it wasn't clearly a good card when it was spoiled, but seeing you play it in your Brago deck has made me like that card a lot more than probably seeing it in any other deck. It just does a lot of work. It just feels like so often you solve the problem and put cards in your hand, and that just feels terrible. like when someone's going to go, you think okay, this is going to set Max back and I can maybe take him out next turn. Mystic Confluence comes down, keeps me from doing my thing, and you've gotten further ahead by drawing cards.
Yeah, and for those out there in listener land probably wondering why Mystic Confluence over something like Cryptic Command, that 3rd blue pip is really hard for me to hit consistently in Brago. Even though I have mana and mana rocks, I just feel comfortable knowing that I only always need 2 blue versus having 3 available at any time.
We mentioned countering a spell and drawing a card, but the return target creature to its owner's hand part is pretty relevant in a deck where you need to get through for damage with Brago. Being able to knock that one flyer someone has out of the way that they think is keeping them safe, so you can poke through and then untap everything, is something that I've seen you use quite a bit as well. And I guess, I did say before that these are all hard counter. Technically, Confluence isn't. It's counter target spell unless the controller pays 3. But you can make that a hard counter if you need to. If you need to turn it up to 9, you can do that.
Right, because you can choose any of those modes multiple times. That's what I really like about that card. So, you know what? I'll do the counter thing twice and draw a card, or counter bounce, or, whatever I need to do. Or, heck, let them pay 9 but have no mana left to do anything else the rest of the turn. They don't have mana to give that creature haste, off of a land or something. So sometimes just spending 5 mana to make them pay an additional 9 is worth it.
And just doing it for 3, though, isn't nothing. That's a lot of times something someone can't pay. 3 is a big deal, too.
Or if they do it, screws up their turn. Like they had a plan for the other 5 mana they have, and now they're down to 2,
Yep. So we can talk about my second one here. Okay. This is my Talrand Sky Summoner deck. And Talrand's at 6 total counterspells. We have Abjure, Counterspell, Fierce Guardianship, which is the new one from the Commander Precon that's free to cast if you control your commander, Muddle the Mixture, Narset's Reversal, and Swan Song. So this is a much different package than what I have under Asperia. So Fierce Guardianship is the first one I'll mention. The reason that's in this Talrand deck and it isn't in Asperia, not to mention, it's expensive too. It's like a $35 card. So you obviously can't have too many of them, or at least most people don't. Asperia isn't a crucial part of that deck. I usually cast Asperia in most games when it's convenient, but the deck doesn't need to cast Asperia. It's just one extra Sphinx I always have available. Nothing the deck does requires that to be in play, compared to Talrand, where Talrand absolutely needs to be in play. And I can't count on casting that counterspell in that Asperia deck, whereas my Talrand deck, not only can I kind of count on Talrand always being out, if I don't have Talrand out, I'm probably in a place where I don't care about countering a spell because I'm probably losing anyway. So it just is a perfect place for it in the Talrand deck, and Asperia is the worst place for it, basically. Abjure is just a weird counterspell where you have to sacrifice a blue permanent, but it's a perfect deck for it, again, because I'll just sacrifice one of my Drakes, one that probably already attacked and is tapped, and it will make another Drake that's untapped. And it's one single mana, so it's efficient. And that's what, again, I'm running a pretty efficient counterspell package here. Abjure is only 1 mana, Swan Song is only 1, Fierce Guardianship is 3, but for the most part I'm casting it for free, and the rest are all blue mana, double blue. In this deck, being mono blue, the blue pips are by and large irrelevant, so I'm okay with Counterspell or Narcissus Reversal. That blue is really easy to hit. It's also a deck where I don't have a mana drain just because it's an expensive card and there's only so many that are worth picking up for decks. If Mana Drain was a $5 card, I would have one in here. It's not, so I don't.
I think if Mana Drain was a $5 card, everybody would have it in their deck.
Yes. If I was walking down the sidewalk, walking my dog after we got done recording here and I found a Mana Drain, it would go in the deck. But it's also not a competitive enough deck. I'm worried about picking one up for it, so I don't have one here. Narcissus Reversal is nice, and not only is it a pretty decent counterspell, this is the kind of deck where it's worthwhile countering my own spell to make a copy of it, return it to my hand, and then just to recast it if I need to, just for value of making Drakes. Muddle the Mixture can go find Cyclonic Rift if I need to, using the Transmute mode on it. So that's why that's there. But yeah, this is a deck where I want my spells to be fairly efficient because I'm casting a lot of things in a single turn. But I also am able to spend blue mana like it's, colorless mana for the most part because it's a mono blue deck and almost all my sources are blue. So those are the different choices there and why I've picked those. Now, this is a deck where I probably could run a few of those luxury counterspells like Mystic Confluence. I could very easily run Cryptic Command here and the trip blue wouldn't really be a problem at all. I think some of that, too, is the same reason there isn't a mana drain in this deck. I kind of like the fact that most of the cards I'm running here are relatively cheap. Swan Song's not anymore, but it was when I got it. Fierce Guardianship, I just happened to get that precon, so I have it here.
Right.
But this is a deck I'm just not too worried about, how strong it necessarily is. And I actually kind of like the fact that there's a lot of, pretty under-the-radar cards in it, relatively speaking. So I could run the more exotic ones that do extra things in addition to countering spells. Probably okay here, but it's just not quite the play style of the deck. They would be fine. Max, your Tuvasa deck, I think, is next here.
My Tuvasa deck has 2 counterspells in it. So the 2 that are in there are an Arcane Denial and Pact of Negation. Pact is in there because I had a spare. And
sure, okay.
So Tuvasa is my Voltron deck. It's fast. I want to win early in the game. So I don't run a lot of counterspells in this deck just because Tuvasa's cheap. Most of the spells in the deck are cheap. So I can bounce back from board wipes fairly efficiently, but I also don't want to have to deal with that overloaded rift when I'm about to kill someone. So,
right.
And the fact that I draw so many cards in that deck, I feel like I see them pretty often. Like, I'm not mystical tutoring for them or hoping I find one. I tend to find one whenever I play the deck, and they're literally just there for rift protection or board wipe protection to make sure I can secure a victory. Arcane Denial, 1 blue pip. This is a 3-color deck. I don't want to be reliant on needing 2 blue for something like Rewind or Counterspell or Narcissus Reversal. And Pact of Negation is, I'm not going to cast that before turn 5, but I definitely like having it just so if I am tapped out, I probably can pay that on my next upkeep.
Sure. It's also really easy to not think in terms of counterspells when you're looking at a Tuvasa deck. Because it's so heavy enchantment based, your brain just kind of doesn't think in terms of they're going to be I know you have counterspells in this deck, but I'm consistently surprised when you counter a spell.
Well, thank you. Maybe that's the goal. That should be the goal. Yeah.
Sure. Well, especially Pact. I definitely don't expect to see Pact and Negation in that deck. So that's neat because like it's definitely like it's a deck that doesn't feel like it's a blue deck, and I'm definitely not ready for counterspells, let alone one when you're tapped out.
Right. I mean,
so that's very, very effective.
Fierce Guardianship would probably be really good in this deck, but it comes down to the fact that I want a hard counter, not a instant or sorcery, or a non-creature spell.
So my last one here is EDHRec by Master of Trest, a deck I don't play very often, but it's still together, and I do update it when something new comes out. EDHRec is running 15 total counterspells, so this is much more serious counterspell land here. When I actually do play it, I do have the ability to control things if I need to. It's running Abjure, Arcane Denial, Delay, Fierce Guardianship, Foil, Force of Negation, Force of Will, Mana Drain, Muddle Mixture, Pact of Negation, Swan Song, and a Unified Will. And it also has 3 creature counterspells, Mausoleum Wanderer, Spellstutter Sprite, and Spiketail Hatchling, all of which are 1-drop flyers that have an ability to sacrifice the creature to counterspell, unless its controller pays 1 mana, I think, in the case of Mausoleum Wanderer. Same thing with Spiketail Hatchling, and I think Spellstutter Sprite is the number of fairies you control, and it's a fairy. So those are basically just there as evasive 1-drops for an EDHRec kind of flying man deck that have the added utility of occasionally catching somebody off guard and countering a spell.
Unified Will is super cool. I've never seen that card before.
So Unified Will counters a spell if you control more creatures than your opponent.
Why don't you run that in Talrand?
I probably should. Now that we're talking about it, I probably should. I think actually it was in there once upon a time, and I only have one, and I never have replaced it. So I put it in my EDHRec deck and never took it out of. I never put it back in Talrand.
That makes sense.
The thought process there is that this EDHRec deck is so aggressive and goes so quickly. If I'm at a point in the game where I don't have more creatures than somebody else, I'm just losing. They're like, there's no coming back. The other person's deck is so much better than mine, or someone is so much faster, or they've locked me out so much that it's just not going to do what needs to get done anyway. I'm going to lose. So that's not, of course, universally true, but like more often than not, that is the case. Only 2 of these 15 spells are double blue. It is a 2-color deck, but it's so aggressive and I'm putting things out so quickly, it's really difficult to leave any mana up, let alone 2 mana, let alone 2 mana of the same color. So I really try to avoid double blue if at all possible. Mana Drain, again, is crazy good, so that one's okay. I'll allow it, but Muddle Mixture, being able to transmute and go get a couple of cards that actually win the game, that's almost more of a tutor a win condition than it is actually a counterspell, but I can obviously use it to counterspell stuff, so that's why that's in there. But other than that, I want the stuff to be really efficient. There's 5 different counterspells in here that can be cast when I'm tapped out. Fierce Guardianship, Force of Negation, Foil, Force of Will, and Pact of Negation. Because the deck's so aggressive, I want the ability to save my stuff even when I'm tapped out. So I have 5 different spells in here that can be cast when tapped out. And once upon a time, I even had Thwart in here, which is a really bad one of those that I think you have to bounce 3 islands to your hand to cast it for free. And I still saved myself once or twice, years ago with Thwart, bad as it is, because I would be tapped out and would need that ability to stop a board wipe or something from happening. So that's the main concern here, is like stopping that board wipe or stopping a fog or something before I can like start chaining extra turns or chaining, overwhelming stampedes or something to kill the table. That's the concern here. So the choices that are made here, I absolutely do not want a Cryptic Command in this deck. I'm just never going to have 5 mana up to use it. I'm never going to have Mystic Confluence mana up. I'm just not going to, it's tough enough keeping double blue from Mana Drain. So this is even more so than the rest of my decks, one where I need to be as efficient and easy to cast with these counterspells as possible. What's your last one here, Max?
My last one is Chulane, and this is still kind of in that 3 CMC or greater tribal with Karuga as a companion. And I only run 1 in that deck, and that's Mystic Confluence, because, again, I had them, and it was over 3 CMC, so I put it in the deck just as a worst-case scenario break glass type thing.
Sure. And that's a deck you've only been playing a little while as well, right?
Yeah, a couple months here, and it doesn't really come out that often just because it's, Chulane has a stigma on them, and
sure.
it is, it's fun to play once, but it's not something I'm going to sit down and play every game in every pod I play in every night,
So those are the 3 decks we have that have counterspells in them, and why we've made the choices we've made with those particular counters. Let's maybe talk a little bit about some counterspells we like in general and why we like them. And you mentioned Arcane Denial, Max. Arcane Denial is 1 blue to hard counterspell, and during the next upkeep, you draw a card, and the person who had the spell counter draws 2 cards. So the downside here is they're drawing 2 cards, and you're only getting 1. But it's a hard counter with only a single blue pip. And that seems bad, I guess. And I remember thinking it was bad when I first saw it years ago. I'm like, why would I run that over just regular counterspell? Except that single blue pip is a huge difference sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you get into, even in some 2-color decks where maybe blue isn't your primary color, or like in your Sphinx's deck where the rest of the deck is super mana hungry. That single blue pip just makes it easy because then you don't have to worry about setting 2 aside or worrying about, did I tap my mana rock or whatnot. Also, the nice thing about Arcane Denial is the person who draws 2 cards, it's a May. So if they don't want to get hit by like a Nekuzar or something like that, they don't have to. They don't have to draw the 2 cards.
And I don't think you want to do this all the time or something, but I have in the past when someone's gone to cast something in my Talrand deck, against my Talrand deck, and I've counterspelled it, either because I had Swarm Intelligence out or I had to use a Primal Amulet for mana for the counterspell. I've made a copy of that counterspell, which doesn't do you any good for the most part. I have on at least one occasion used Arcane Denial to copy the copy of my counterspell, just because it's doing no good. And then basically that turns it into a 2 mana draw 3 during next upkeep. You can't, that's not a reason to run the card, but like, you can do that kind of thing once in a while. There's that option there if you are desperate enough or just need the draws badly enough and you happen to have 2 other counterspells in your hand and you've got, a mana rock that you don't need on turn 11. Cast the mana rock and counter it just to get the 3 draws. I mean, I've seen more wasteful plays than that just to get cards in hand. So it's something you can do as well with Arcane Denial. I think it's, if you're playing like CEDH or something where you just can't give anyone any edge in terms of cards, I get why you might not want to play it, but outside of that environment, I think it's a really underappreciated counterspell, and I think you do too, Max.
Yes.
Are there any other ones that you kind of like or think are underrated or underappreciated that you want to highlight here that people should maybe play more?
I like Mystic Confluence. It's one of my go-tos, but I think it also falls in that bucket of more like typical EDH. It's a big splashy spell versus efficient.
Sure.
And it's modular, so like you don't have to use the counter. I've used it just to pay 5, draw 3. I've used it in that mode. I've bounced 3 things. Yeah. It's nice. I like Pact of Negation. I like that just being able to pull it out of the hat as long as you can pay for it at the next turn. Those are typically my go-to 3 are Denial, Mystic Confluence, and Pact of Negation.
Well, the thing I'll mention about Mystic Confluence here, too, because this happened last night in a game, and back-to-back turns with that Athreos deck of mine, I cast Ambition's Cost and Ancient Craving.
Of course you did.
Both of which are 4 mana, draw 3 cards in black at sorcery speed, and they deal 3 damage to you. So Mystic Confluence is 1 more mana than that at instant speed, and it doesn't deal you damage to draw 3. I'm not going to say that's better necessarily because there's a sweet spot there where 4 is maybe less than 5 and easier to handle, but that's pretty comparable. I didn't feel remotely bad about spending 4 mana and losing 3 life to draw 3 cards. I don't think you should feel remotely bad about spending 5 mana at instant speed once you're sure nothing bad is going to happen, right before your turn starts to draw 3 cards. I think that's a perfectly valid use of Mystic Confluence. So yeah, I think that card is really solid, and I think that utility is fantastic on it. If you can run one and your deck allows you to have that kind of mana-free floating, then yeah, that's a great card. I'm a fan of Delay. That's out of a Time Spiral block, and again, it's 1 blue, something I like on a counterspell. You can counter target spell, so it's a hard counter, but you then remove the spell from the game with 3 time counters on it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. And it gains Suspend. So at the beginning of the owner's upkeep, remove a time counter on it, and then when the last one is removed, that player casts it without paying its mana cost. If it's a creature, it also gains Haste, which is part of Suspend. So basically, it buys you 3 turns. That's usually enough to do what you're doing, I've found. particularly like if it's a board wipe or something, when your board presence has got out of control and someone's like, I need to Wrath of God this, you can probably delay that Wrath of God. And then if your board presence was scary enough to get a Wrath of God cast against you in the first place, it's probably scary enough to kill that person before that delay goes off.
Oh, for sure.
Additionally, there's a whole lot of spells that become useless once you delay them. Whether it's someone's combat trick or someone's counterspell of your counterspell, delaying that is just a hard counter. And that when that comes back into play during our upkeep, it's doing nothing. So there's a whole lot of times, too, that delay just winds up stopping the thing from happening if it doesn't outright just make it worthless by having it, not come into play for 3 turns. So I think delay is really underappreciated and should see more play, especially in decks where it's relevant not having to have access to double blue. Any more final ones you want to highlight here, Max?
Nothing I really want to highlight, but I would like to mention that, when you minus your EDHRec deck, we aren't running an abundance of counter spells. We aren't running, a dozen of them, minus your EDHRec deck,
right.
But that's more borderline CEDH level play. And I think that's just kind of what I want the listeners to pay attention to, is that you don't need to run a dozen counter spells in your mono blue deck or your 2-color deck just because you're in blue. Find the ones that are going to solve the problems you want solved so you can still win the game and not waste people's time, I guess, just by countering everything or being that blue player.
Well, I also think there's an element of it where if you have, 12 or 15 counterspells in your deck and people feel like you're counterspelling everything they do, that can then generate threat on you as a player and make things more difficult. I feel like if you're at that 5 or 6 slot range, you have to be much more selective with what you counterspell, and it lets people still play the game to the point where they don't want to focus you. I think you can get to a point with counterspells where someone's like, I don't even want to deal with this person and their 22 counterspell deck, and they're just going to try to take you out. Whereas I think if you are using them surgically, people are much more likely to just treat it like a removal spell and not an annoyance, if that makes sense. So I think flying under the radar with your counterspells, I think, is useful.
I definitely agree with that.
All right, so that, I think, is going to kind of wrap up what we wanted to talk about with counterspells today. I'm curious what the listeners think, both in terms of how they determine what counters are going to run in decks and why they run those spells. How many you run, we just got done talking about that too, and I'm wondering if that makes sense, what we said about kind of flying under the radar with how many counters you're running versus making it obvious you're trying to control the game with counterspells. And also, any ones that you particularly like or dislike and want to talk about, because I think that's always useful to hear. Counterspells are the kind of thing where they've been printing them, in every set since the beginning of the game, and it's really easy to miss that one counterspell that came out back in Odyssey or something that winds up being really good in one particular deck, like Abjure happens to be in Talrand, or how Unified Will happens to be quite good in EDHRec. It's really easy to miss those as well, so I'd love to hear about any deck-specific counterspells that happen to be great in your deck that people might not know about. So reach out to us and tell us what those are. We'd love to hear it. That is going to wrap up episode 212. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at YSquishy1. You will hopefully be able to find him here too, maybe next week. That's the goal anyway.
That is the goal.
That is the goal. Our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, and our show is edited by the esteemed Rafael Garcia, who you can find on Twitter at Earthsparewalker. Until next week, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.